James, this is such a personal story. Talk about writing it and what made you want to share this with the world?
The 3 kids that I have, they're now too old. They don't care about me anymore. But back several years ago, they really liked bedtime stories and always liked the stories most of my childhood. And sometimes I would change the ending, frankly, to make them happier endings. But they were really interested. And one time, my wife and I were driving over the 59th Street Bridge, and they said, "Dad, we want to see where you grew up." So we pulled off, got Queens Boulevard, and I don't know if anybody knows New York here, but we basically went to my house, and it was way smaller than I remembered it, and my kids sort of looked at it and went, "Huh?" And I remember seeing my neighbor looking out the window whom I'd recognized, and I didn't talk to him. Frankly, I was avoiding him because I knew his wife had died not too long before that. And I realized there was very little evidence, actually, that I had ever lived there. There was some paint on the wall where I used to make my little model rockets. But that was about it. And I became very melancholy in a way that I didn't quite expect. And I started to realize, then my father was still alive, and my brother, thank heavens, is. But everybody else in the movie, my mother, my grandparents, my great and granduncle, all gone. And how ephemeral it all is. And how all those momentous dinners, which seemed so important, there's no evidence of those people and of those dinners. And that filled me with a certain emotion. I suppose I kind of wanted to bring them back to life in a way, even if they're not 100% beautiful to our eye, you know?
I love that. And talking about, and changing the endings, your editor, Scott Morris.
I did not change the ending on this picture.
But talk about working with Scott and how, that phone call that you got from James, and what did he say to you about this film?
I don't remember. I'm going to be interested to hear this. I have no recollection at all. What did I say to you?
Let's hear it, Scott.
Well, you were, it was a great phone call to get. You were kind of wonderful, and you pretty much just asked me to do it. And
why didn't you tell them we'd worked together?
Oh,
We're
yeah,
slaving away on other pictures. He's
Yes,
acting
we
like I
worked
just
together for
randomly
years.
called him up. Hi, Scott, come to the movie.
Yeah. We worked together on Lost City of Z and Ad Astra, and Ad Astra went on for 2 years, and we got very close as that film went through a lot of revisions. And I trained with John Axelrod and Lee Haugen on those other 2 films, and John wasn't available to do this, and he'd recommended me, and James and I had that relationship, so it was a natural, call to get, and it's just such an honor, to be kind of learning from James over the years, and then to have him ask me to do this.
Such an honor to learn from me. What are you talking about? It's such a nice man. He's such a nice young man. He's so full of it. We were. It's in the trenches, You make a film, right? You're struggling. Everything's a struggle. Is that going to make any sense to anybody? Is that going to work narratively? Is that boring? Whatever, And he's saying that I learned so much. He's such a nice man.
How early did you bring him into the process?
As early as I possibly could. I'm. The whole thing has been nuts. I'm obviously not the only person. I'm the only person who had gone through the pandemic, by the way. I'm the only person. No, the pandemic made everything nuts, And we had a cast lined up, and then the world ended, and had to recast, and everyone's schedule changed, and John's schedule changed, your schedule changed, Darius Kanji, the cinematographer, his schedule changed. Somehow we got it all together at some point. The script was written in 2019, which is very weird because, context has its way with you. Sometimes you're hostage to it, sometimes you're beneficiary of it. But, it was pre-January 6th, it was pre-George Floyd, pre-Black Lives Matter, pre-election contesting, all that stuff. And it seems more topical now than it did even when I wrote it, which I'm not proud of, actually. But that's a whole other conversation. Anyway, how did I get into that? I'm sorry.
But I want to talk about your casting. Jeremy Strong is phenomenal. Anne Hathaway, Anthony Hopkins, and of course finding Banks. How did you find Banks to play Paul?
Well, I loved both those boys they went through the same process, which was, first of all, I had a great casting director, a guy named Doug Abel I've worked with for many, many years. But I said to him, cast, and he said, well, do you want to limit it to New York? I said, well, you can if you want, but I think you have to see the whole country. And really, that was one of the dumber things I said, because I think I saw 600 tapes, which is a lot. And my morning ritual, I'd open up the laptop and I'd have my cup of coffee, and it would be like my casting director would, zoom in and say, today you have 107. And you can't start at you can't start and then just cut it off or whatever, because sometimes the kids would warm up and be beautiful in the middle. Sometimes the kid would start strong and then peter out. Sometimes if you'd want to weigh in and give them an adjustment. So you couldn't sort of like just zoom through it or something. Or zoom through, you can't say that now. Speed through it. You had to see each kid. And this kid, the main character, Banks, Jalen's a little bit of a different story about how I found him. But Banks, he's from North Carolina and has absolutely nothing to do with the character in the film. But he's unbelievably intelligent, and he listens. And what I found with the boys was that they were great at improvising, and they were so bright because they could listen and throw it right back at me when I threw them curveballs during the auditions. But that's it. It's just there's no magic way. You just have to go nuts and bolts through it.
I just want to go back to what you said about, the timeliness of the film. It doesn't feel moralizing at all. It feels like, you discuss racial, injustices and social inequalities. Like, talk about getting that balance right.
Well, first of all, I thank you for that. But what I would say is, I'm glad you felt I got it right. But I felt it was very important to not have an answer, a solution, and that I would fail. I thought it was very important that I fail in the film, because it's very easy to be a superhero. I don't mean that literally like a comic book movie, but I mean a superhero in the sense that you solve all the world's problems in your film, and the character does. And that wasn't the way that I saw it in my childhood. In my childhood, what happened was, instead of getting answers, I got thrown into a greater sense of what I'll call cognitive dissonance. And one of the things I tried to communicate, we tried to communicate, so Tony Hopkins, he says to me, your name is Graff, that's a better name, you're going to fit in. And I told your parents to do that. In other words, he's the one who actually does totally abandon the public school system. And he's the one who says, fit in. But then the next scene, he says, be a good guy, be a mensch, which is a cognitive dissonance for the kid. Even the person who loves him the most and he loves the most is sending him unbelievably confusing messages. And what I was trying to say is that you can be the oppressor and the oppressed at the same time, and that it is not easy to unravel the web that we've created for ourselves and each other in the culture. And that oftentimes we point fingers and moralize, you're stupid, you're an idiot, whatever. It's more tricky than that. And at the same time that something awful would happen to Johnny, I would see Fred Trump saying, what's your last name? Greiseston, what kind of name is that? And I knew what he was saying, and I was 12. I knew exactly what he was trying to do. So my point was that it's an unending series of layers, and no one is really at fault, per se, but we're all to blame.
Talk about finding the perfect house, which is basically your childhood home,
My house, which is 90 feet south from where we shot, the first thing we did, Jez, we went and rang the doorbell of my house. And she didn't answer. And she was Chinese. My father had sold her the house. She was Chinese, and so didn't speak English. So I then, of course, had a friend of ours who spoke Mandarin come to try and talk with her. And then it became clear that actually the problem wasn't the language problem. The problem is she didn't want a large film crew wrecking her house. We found a woman whom I knew and went to high school with, who lived about 3 doors down, who was nice enough to let us take over her house. Now, the houses were all built in literally 1946, right after the war, all this kind of cookie cutter Archie Bunker neighborhood. The neighborhood itself has changed completely. When I grew up there, we were the lone Jewish family on the block. It was, like I said, totally Archie Bunker. And my neighbor that we shared that house with, because it was a semi-attached row house, he looked, talked, acted exactly like Carol O'Connor in All in the Family, except that his name was Charlie, not Archie. And I remember he put the flagpole in just a little bit to his side, and he would say, "Hey, you got to find out who the regular Americans are that live in this house. I fought in a big one, the WW2. I fought in a big one." Like, that's the way he talked. And I remember once, though, my father said something pretty great to me once. There was a gardener who was Latino. I don't know if he was Mexican, but what the Charlie would say, the Mexican here, the Mexican was here, whatever, and he would say terrible things about the guy. And my father said to me once, when I was standing in the next room, I was probably about 11, he left, and he said, "Do you hear the way he's talking about the gardener?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "When we're not around, that's the way he talks about us." And I remember kind of going, okay, and you sort of semi-process it. But that was the neighborhood. Now, it's almost exclusively Asian or Orthodox Jewish, which is very weird, which means the food is way better than it ever was when I grew up. But you see it in the film. Very minimal visual effects work. The crosswalk maybe had a new painted street sign. Maybe there were a couple of things, but the garbage cans were different. Other than that, it was the same. Maybe we painted out some satellite dishes, I think. But that public school where they're walking in the beginning of the movie, that's my public school, PS 173 in Queens. The street where they see the movie, Private Benjamin, that's the street, Fresh Meadow Lane, right near my house. No Fresh Meadow, by the way, anywhere near the neighborhood, but that was the street name, which is a little weird. So you see it all there, warts and all.
What is it like having the film out there for people to see and getting this feedback?
It's very strange because it's like a home movie. So I kind of am simultaneously thrilled and horrified. You know, somebody says they love it, you feel like you just won the lottery. Somebody says they hate it, it means they hate part of you. So I can only tell you that I tried to make it as honestly as I could. We tried to make it as honestly as we could, not sugarcoat it. Thomas Hardy, the writer, he once said, "If a way to the better there be, it lies in taking a full look at the worst." And I kind of thought, for this movie, that makes sense, including, by the way, for myself. I wasn't anxious to make myself look like a hero or somebody great. And it was all part of that MO. Show it, the world as you think it was, not as you wish it were.
Thank you, everybody, for coming out on a Sunday
you.
night. Thank you, James, and thank you, Scott.
Thank you so much.
Congratulations.
Thank
on the
you.
movie.
Thank you, Joe.